Greetings. My name is Francisco Aragon, and I direct Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at the University of Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies. Letras Latinas has been a presence in the Washington, D.C. region for a number of years, and I've always maintained that meaningful collaboration with local organizations has been our bread and butter. Today, we're kicking off our most ambitious partnership in the DC region to date with the Writers Center in Bethesda. Welcome to Curated Conversations, a Latinx Poetry Show. Our first program of what will be monthly installments features Anthony Cody in conversation with Keith S. Wilson, discussing Anthony's book, Borderland Apocrypha. But before I pass the baton to and introduce Keith, I want to thank a few people. The Writers Center has agreed to host us on their platform, and I want to express my gratitude to Zach Powers, Director of Communications. He's our closest collaborator, and his tech expertise and eye for visual design have been crucial. I also want to thank Executive Director Margaret Melanie for her endorsement and support, and a special mention to Amy Freeman, Development Director, who I had the pleasure of meeting roughly 1 year ago at the Arts Club of Washington, where the seed of this collaboration was first planted. I also want to acknowledge the Writers Center in-house publication, Poet Lore, with whom Letras Latinas collaborated a few years ago, and who will have a yet-to-be-determined role at the conclusion of this year-long project. A shout out as well to Angela Spring of Duende District, who will be handling the book-selling component of Curated Conversations, a Latinx poetry show. Duende District is our third co-presenter. Finally, a program as ambitious as this, one that will involve 24 participants, would not be possible without funding. The Poetry Foundation is our principal institutional benefactor. In addition, I want to thank Jim Wilson, whose generous patronage is making possible a parallel book club activity for the debut Latinx books we'll be exploring in the next 12 months. One of the special traits of Curated Conversations is that we ask the debut Latinx poet in question to select their interlocutor. Anthony Cody has invited Keith S. Wilson. He's the author of the collection Field Notes on Ordinary Love, published by Copper Canyon Press. In a piece highlighting the best poetry books of 2019, the New York Times speaks of a, quote, romanticism you expect and want from a younger writer, close quote, but one which is, quote, held in check by a considerable self-questioning intelligence, close quote. A reviewer for the online journal West Branch describes poems that, quote, interrogate systems of beauty and systems of racism while still being open to wonder, close quote. One of the poems that struck me in particular was titled The Way I Hold My Hands, which delineates an indelible portrait of a father and son, a father who reads to his son, but with a complicated undercurrent of potential discord or violence. Hands also figure in the poem that drew me the most, for personal reasons. In 1980, as an elementary schoolboy, I attended what was then a blockbuster art exhibit at the De Young Museum in San Francisco, showcasing impressionist paintings from around the world. I remember vividly one, and only one, canvas, The Floor Scrapers by Gustave Caillebotte from 1875. I recall how I was jolted by what I imagined was, on my part, an incipient homoerotic gaze. And so I was delighted and thrilled with Keith's poem, also titled The Floor Scrapers, one in which the speaker watches the gleam of the fish-throated muscles of the back, the narrow bones, the knees, and later, the knuckles, each a chamber for a whole religion, performed by the hands. I'm pleased to welcome Keith S. Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Francisco, for that introduction, for this space, and for this time. I'm extremely excited to talk with my good friend Anthony about a book of poetry Borderland Apocrypha that I'm just like extremely excited about, just generally to read it, to talk about it, in which we had like a whole, Anthony and I had like a whole convo yesterday that was like probably twice the length of what we're going to be talking about today. So hopefully we cover some of the things that we just ended up talking about yesterday when we were supposed to just be talking about logistics. But before we sort of get into that, I'm going to read a short bio for Anthony, a truncated version. So Anthony Cody is the author of Borderland Apocrypha, Omnidawn, April 2020, the winner of the 2018 Omnidawn Open Book Prize, a 2020 National Book Award finalist in poetry, a 2020 Poets and Writer debut poet, a 2020 Believer Magazine Editor's Long List and Poetry nominee, a 2021 Pan America Gene Stein Award Long List nominee, as well as the winner of a 2020 Southwest Book Award. So I'm just going to stop there because, you know, it's very easy to Google his very impressive bio, and I don't want to embarrass him too much. But
appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Before we really begin, I think it's really important to sort of contextualize this conversation a little bit. So I was hoping you could share a poem with us.
Yeah, no problem. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you, Keith, for being here. I know you and I have been trying to figure out a way we can just like talk together and be together in like any setting. So this is a great opportunity. I appreciate Francisco for having the space with Letras Latinas, the Duende District, as well as the Writer Center for helping host all of this logistically. So I'm going to start with actually the title poem of my collection, which is, if I can move my screen a bit, there we go, which is standing in line to take a passport photo. An old white man looks at me and claims I'm running. Standing here because my grandpa ran away from home to sell perfume in El Zócalo at 9. In line, I am a lot of things. And since I am a lot of things, I am everything he cannot imagine. A passport photo asks me to 2 by 2 myself and capture what I am in neutral. And I recall I have yet to see the chambers of my heart turn tusk. An old white man is not Gil Scott-Heron saying, because I always feel like running, not away, because there is no such place, is not how you pronounce exile or escapar. Looks at me how Teddy Roosevelt died coveting a white buffalo. Claims I am afraid. No, I am a wall. No, I am a mirror. I am still, so still.
Thank you. I mean, so I think one of the things I have questions I want to ask you, but I think even before I get into some of those, it's unique and kind of awesome actually that that we get to have this conversation via Zoom, in part because people can see that poem, like you can both perform it in the way that you sort of expect at a traditional poetry reading, but also because it's sort of a visual poem, there are visual artifacts in that piece. The fact that the audience can sort of see them is really interesting to me. So I kind of want to talk about that just for a moment. I love that this, I think a poem in general, but especially a first poem in a collection often sort of teaches the reader how to read a poem. And so it's really striking that that's a poem that sort of begins with this diagram that sort of reminds me of like a gallows, but it's also sort of, referencing these different things like physically on the page. So I'm wondering, I mean, I'd love to just hear you talk about that, but also even just what comes first for you. Is that sort of like, at least in that poem, but maybe even in general, is it that the sort of the form comes out of the content, the text, or did the
Yeah.
text sort of like demand sort of this sort of diagrammatic thing happening
Yeah.
on the page?
Yeah, that's a good question kind of start off, because it's, for me, when I was writing the poems, I was drafting these poems in different things. I'm always, scribbling on half sheets of paper, backs of envelopes, whiteboards in classrooms, wherever I can get like something to lay out, spread out. But I wasn't necessarily finding a form that really felt right. And it actually ended up being that I found a comic strip piece of paper, and actually I decided to, if I can find it, bring out one of the early drafts that cracked it open. So this, if we can kind of look through, is actually just a daily comic strip document that I picked up. And what ended up happening was I found a title based on an event that happened to me. And what do you do when you end up with a title that's like, 12, what I want to say, like 15 inches long? You have to find a solution with that. So I kind of took that title and then figured out this sort of some ways like a galaxy, some ways like a terrain that I was going to navigate with the poem. And then suddenly the revisions came and the poem started finding its new form, almost like trying to work a Rubik's Cube, and what's working and what's not. You turn it, you don't turn it, you open it up another way. And suddenly these other, I guess it would be cascading elements happen from this title. And then as everything's laying out and then I step away, I see something like a gallows. I see something like a border. I see something that's all of those things that are innately like in us while we're sitting in any situation. Like right now we're having this conversation, but in the back of our head, might also be wondering about, did I turn off the stove? I think I did. So we're good. We can keep going. But I did have that thought while we were talking. So like all these things that are happening in us in that simultaneity are happening on the page. And it's interesting in the other part of talking about the Zoom, because the book launched, I actually received the book the day everything shut down in California. And I have never actually experienced what it's like to read from my book in real life. So I don't even know how I would navigate the book at a reading. So definitely the virtual component opens up a lot of windows for me that I might not necessarily have had going somewhere and not having access to a computer or the internet or a projector to help engage. So it's been a really interesting experience to how to work through that in this virtual setting.
Yeah. One of the things I think is really interesting about what you just said is sort of describing the terrain, right? Like this is a kind of language that exists throughout the book, but I think it's really interesting if you imagine there's sort of a traditional format for a book of poetry. Like if you look at a book of shelf of anyone who owns poems, the vast majority of them all like sort of line up in terms of their height, right? And or how wide they are. And so this poem, this first poem that you've read, in some ways sort of determines the landscape of the entire book, and all the other poems sort of fit within that landscape. And so it reminds me sort of it simulates a thing that the book is often sort of about bodies sort of living in a landscape, right? That's like that exists and is sort of limits your movement. That I think is really fascinating. And just like, I don't know, just this is a book that's written sort of or printed as I should have showed a moment ago, like horizontally, and informs all the poems because of that.
And
yeah, go ahead.
I think I think it's interesting because, while I've been working through a lot of these poems and thinking about sort of some of like the topography of how it's laid out, because I'm thinking it like also how we're looking through and working through it like in layers and depths, right? Because there are moments where text is overlaying and one another. So it's, both across the the XY axis, but also maybe the Z axis, right?
Yeah.
Which isn't necessarily something we can do in the 2D book. But you said something about the limitations of like a landscape, or like the rule that once the book is made. And I think that's kind of interesting, because one of the things that I was really I wouldn't say struggling with, I would say challenging maybe at the time when I was putting the book together, or right before I started actually assembling the poems really and writing the poems, was the limitations of like the 8.5 by 11 page for a poem. And because intrinsically, we've all written anything really, a poem, an assignment, a to-do list. When you get to the bottom of the page, you're done, right? It's like, oh, I made it. We've made it to the finish line. Ta-da. And then what that does to the conversation and our own imagination when we're now restricted to this border of the 8.5 by 11. So kind of trying to open that up and looking through what that can do for me, at least when I was trying to go through and look at these poems and studying and working through an archive, kind of helped open up something that felt more limitless, but then obviously in the reality of the tangible, it becomes its new sort of structure.
Yeah, I mean, so that sort of maybe is an interesting sort of transition into my next question. This sort of idea of the opening up of a limited imagination. So, having heard and seen your poetry, I think one of the things that I found really interesting about it, from the very beginning, from the first time I ever saw your work or heard you perform it, is that it talks about these. It doesn't talk around these sort of historical and systemic crimes, crimes that are committed by American people, but also the American government. And so it's lyrical and beautiful, but it's also like very political. And having been in workshops with you and also writing political and visual poetry myself, we've sort of talked about this before, that there's often a lot of pushback that you get for writing political work, for writing experimental work, for just literally even talking about race at all, like whether it's experimental or visual, that gets pushed back. And so I think there's a lot of expectations about the way that a writer of color ought to be writing and what they ought to be writing about. And so, yeah, one of the things I really love about this collection is the way that it pushes back on a lot of the prescribed ways of writing. It's like overtly political. Parts of it are in Spanish, but like it never has like those little footnotes at the bottom that tells you, that like translates it for you. It experiments with lyricism, but also with visual lyricism. So my question is, a lot of marginalized people like feel a lot of pushback when they're writing, for instance, writing experimental poetry. So what was it about this particular book, or you as a person, or this like moment in history that made you like push through that and then push back, like continue to write this kind of poetry?
Yeah, that's kind of a good way to kind of frame it, because part of me says age, because if I look at my body of work, my like the things I wrote like 10 years ago, which obviously if we look at any of our work that we wrote 15, 20, 30 years ago, it's going to be dramatically different, right? But in that aging, I guess I started ending up facing my own frustrations of the limitation of what the page does for me, and what it wasn't doing for me. And in that kind of assessment, I always say this, but it's true that it really did open up something for me, is that Juan Felipe Herrera said to me, abandon the left margin. And it was the most liberating. It's like one of those things, like imagine when, fire was made or something, that it was like, oh, well, yeah, if you rub the two sticks together, there's going to be some heat. Okay, cool. And that's it really opened up something for me in starting to push the things that I had been wanting to do, but I don't think I had been intentional about it. So was I scattering things on a page over time? Yes. Was I trying to like move beyond 8.5 by 11? Not yet. And so that was kind of part of that opening, that one door I walked through. And then the other one obviously is that political climate. I mean, when we talk about things like, when we talk about lynchings in the Southwest, we have to talk about lynchings in the South. We have to talk about slavery. We have to talk about Native removal. We have to talk about Chinese Exclusionary Act. We have to talk about Japanese internment. We have to talk about segregated schools in Mexico and segregated schools in Texas for Mexicans. We have to talk about Muslim bans. We have to talk about, and you keep going and you start seeing like how that cascade happens, right? Like history is always on the side of the empire and how they can write it and how they can frame it. So then suddenly now, when we're now having a conversation about something like the Trail of Tears, it's, you know, some folks moved from Florida to the middle of the country. The Civil War is about states' rights. And so it's kind of, you know, like all these things for a writer coming from communities that are historically like marginalized, it starts kind of overwhelming you. And I think I kind of reached that point where I was like, I just have to let it go. I have to just push it out and abandon all the things that have been my hangups in my writing and just do it. And it kind of was that for me. And then on the other side, I did have time. I had the gift of time to just work on my writing. And that was the first time, I think, in all 36 years of my life at the time, I had never done. I had never just focused on writing. I had always done 19 different things, 8 different jobs, and now I had a little bit of time.
I mean, even with this collection, what you're doing is not just right. You're also like laying out pages. So like it's like a very time intensive. I don't know if anyone's ever sort of worked in InDesign and done layout sort of for a newspaper or anything at any point in your life, but it's like very time consuming and difficult. So you're like adding that on top of the sort of expected act in poetry anyway, of just like the writing itself. So yeah.
It's its own thing, because suddenly when you're oh wait, I don't have to worry about that page size. Suddenly it's like, well, okay, now I have to change the page size. Then everything has to change again, right? It's not, the design programs aren't as helpful as like Word, when you just change the margin, you change everything.
Yeah.
So that was that. I mean, that was definitely a painstaking thing. I do have to give it up to Omnidawn and to Jillian Hamel. They were instrumental in just helping make it happen. I mean, some of the things I could not have imagined trying to fit in real life. I have a very, very distinct memory of finishing an early draft, texting someone and saying, I have made a book that no one will ever be able to, like, financially, like within the realms of capitalism, want to publish unless they're just trying to just lose money every time they make it. And Omnidawn was like, no, I think this works. Do this way, done. And so that helped kind of do that. So doing a lot of design and doing that in conjunction with them was its own process. I remember I was in the middle of my MFA program and I had to go to my teachers and be like, I'm going to have to go off grid for 2 weeks. I can't tell you why, because it wasn't public yet, but I have a deadline that I have to meet that will be really cool when you learn why, but I'll see you in the end of whatever month it was at the time.
Yeah. I mean, so this is like leads into, we're sort of already talking about this, but one of the things I think is like another element of your book that really comes across when you see it, is that this book really utilizes white space. And having heard you, like everyone's had a chance now to sort of hear you perform a poem that has a lot of white space. And so there's maybe some sense of what that space might mean in terms of like performance, like, you know, a sense of rhythm or breath. But I also sort of throughout the book, read into it, that's a kind of, at least the way I interpreted it, a kind of like visual representation of distance and creation of these sort of like false borders, and references to sort of written documents that people have made. And so I kind of want to hear you talk a little bit about the politics or meaning of that space, of like using white space on the page in this way.
Yeah. I think about, of a book like Mariposa Boy, the memoir from Roberto Gonzalez, and his memories of crossing the border back and forth, of that it was something in another era before like a heavy militarized ICE society that we now live in. People moved freely. I think about my grandfather who crossed the border numerous times. I remember asking him like what and how, and he like, it was like, well, I was 9 here, and then I was there, and and like there's a certain movement in that. So sometimes that space in the page is also sort of is representing sort of that distance and that movement that sort of was and has been happening between spaces, between countries, between places that we identify as home, or what would be home. And sort of sometimes it's that malleability. I know there's a section, the Prelude to a Mexican Lynching, on the treaty. Maybe I can share that.
Yeah, please.
I can read it. Okay, I'll read that. So there's the poem that I will, once I share it, it will look a little bit, make more sense. And I'll share just a portion. So this treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was, I found it in the US registry. And oddly enough, it had like side-by-side translation in both English and Spanish. And I thought, here we are moving back and forth between these two languages, between these two tongues, and right here in a US document, in a federal document. And I thought, okay, let me try to translate this. And so I wrote it, and I think I spent like 3 months on it, just translating it, trying to make it work as like a contrapuntal, like in a bilingual contrapuntal. And finally, when I was done, I was like, something's not right. Something doesn't feel right. And I remember very clearly just putting the dotted hashed line in the middle of the poem, because I thought it has to be sort of not a permanent structure that we pass through. Even now, the border wall is not a permanent structure that we can, like, people can pass through it, or animals can pass through it if necessary, right? So I'll read it. This is the last portion of Prelude to a Mexican Lynching. This is Article 22. God forbid el mundo observa la naturaleza, as absolute observance shall be possible. 1. Arregula el pie, llevar todo. Upon the entrance of the armies into the territories of the other, women and children, ecclesiastics, scholars of every faculty, cultivators of the earth, merchants, artisans, manufacturers, and fishermen, unarmed and inhabiting fortified towns, villages, or places, and in general all persons whose occupations are for the common subsistence and benefit of mankind, shall be burnt. Por la fuerza. 2. La suerte, distritos convenientes. Para los que use poder, mira bajo la mano. Allow a commissary of the other, which shall be to employ. Se declara que la guerra destruye. Article 23. The United States fe limits in quintuplicate our Lord in cuevas. God forbid, as absolute observance shall be impossible upon the entrance of the armies into the territories of the other, women, children, ecclesiastics, scholars of every faculty, cultivators of earth, merchants, artisans, manufacturers, and fishermen, and unarmed and inhabiting unfortified towns, villages, or places, and in general all persons whose occupations are for the common subsistence and benefit of mankind, shall be burned. Allow a commissary of the other, which shall be to employ. The United States limits in quintuplicate our Lord. El mundo observa la naturaleza, arregla el pie, llevar todo, por la fuerza. 2. la suerte distritos convenientes. Para los que use poder, mira bajo la mano. Se declara que la guerra destruye fe en cuevas. There we go.
So
And go ahead.
So one of the things that's really interesting about that is of hearing it read. And I don't know how much of a sense people will get of this if they haven't already read the book or this poem, but the way that the poems are laid out, it's not always like immediately clear that there's like a definitive way to read it, and it feels like there isn't, right? Like I think the moment that you read a poem out loud, it becomes it feels sort of definitive. So if anyone's ever heard Gwendolyn Brooks read "We Real Cool," like that's the way that the poem's supposed to be read after you read it. But like if you like, I think you share a lot in common with like Douglas Kearney, whose work is visual, but also is sort of like a roadmap in some ways of different ways of performing. So like a script that can also be performed many different ways. So yeah, it's really cool to sort of see how your performance there like differs from the way that I initially read it.
And that, that's an interesting thing, because I will say that in sort of veering into the experimental and kind of looking how a page can be navigated, I know intrinsically that I am giving up that power to the reader, right? So like it's really creating this conversation that I can put indicators, I can put cues, I can drop footnote numbers at the bottom of an opening section to be 1, 2, 3, 4 to kind of guide a reader through, or how our eyes are normally trained to read, romantic script from left to right, things like that, like little things that you can do, or clockwise versus counterclockwise, things like that, where we train our eye naturally. But ultimately just kind of thinking through that when I go on to read a poem, I sometimes don't have a necessary answer of how I'm going to read it. Like right now, right before I went and read the poem, I was debating if I was going to read English only, Spanish only, both, or everything. And I thought, well, I'll just read it all, because here we are.
Yeah. I think so. When it's the case that people have sort of this hang up where they're like, I don't know how to like interpret this thing. I personally think that that's often a hang up that poets have, because like poets are used to reading in a particular, they have like a tradition of reading. They have like a certain literacy of how a thing's supposed to be read. And I think that like one of the things that your work is doing is you mentioned like giving up the power to the reader. It democratizes the reading process in a way that I think is sort of similar to the way that visual art works. Like visual artists are so much more comfortable with letting a person both like approach the thing that they've created however they want to approach it, in terms of like maybe they'll look up at the upper right corner for a long time and then like move left, and maybe they'll start at the bottom left and move up, or like who knows. But also even just like walking away from that painting and maybe having just radically different opinions about what that painting's like about. And poets are like just like not traditionally or largely as far as I can tell, like comfortable with that. Like they're really about a lot of times like there's like a certain kind of openness to a lot of poems, but like you're supposed to, as you mentioned, often read top to bottom, left to right. And often there is like kind of like there is like a meaning that they really kind of want you to get. And so, yeah.
And I think that's, I kind of think that also speaks to and lends itself to a specific kind of work when you're working and sifting through an archive, because, when you're doing research and when you're like going and reading and looking through books and looking through internet archives and places that I couldn't travel to, but thankfully through the internet, I can, research and kind of look through things. There is sort of this natural culling that you're doing as the creator of the piece, right? You're saying this piece of the archive has relevance, this one does not, but in reality, they're on equal footing, right? There's nothing to say this one was better or this one is not. It just, at the time, that was either my intentional or subconscious kind of act to say, hey, this is what I want to include or not. And I think that helps kind of recreate some of that sifting of the archive for the reader, that they have, that folks do have to kind of sit with and work through and kind of like go along on that same kind of research, which for me, adding kind of that tactile element where people have to turn it and move it around. I think you and I remember we were in a community writers workshop with Sharon Olds, and it was one of the poems that I would have that you had to turn around, and she goes, "Oh, an Anthony poem." And then handed it out. And I remember that very distinctly, like, oh my gosh, Sharon Olds just identified a poem of mine. But also what that does for the memory, right? You know, you're now engaging like new modalities, new structures with a person, and having to like sift through that maybe wouldn't be there if it was a very sort of linear, direct way to engage, potentially.
Yeah. So, and that, I keep saying traditional, but I think it's actually important to note that, like, even though I keep saying that, I'm talking about like a certain kind of expectation from like the like popular publishing industry, which means white Western English tradition. And there are like many traditions, right? There's the archival tradition. There are non-Western traditions. There are just tons of traditions. Like poetry is often thought of today as a sort of a written form, but it like didn't start that way. And so if it's going to be on the page, why does it have to be sort of the way that you write like business documents? Why can't it be a thing that you have to hold and turn in your hand in that way?
It's an interesting thing, because I know for like sometimes for like readings and events or things I'm like organizing and sharing, I often share my agenda, and I share like a two-sided agenda. There's the Gutenberg agenda and then there is the the one on the press that we would be able to crank out, and then there's like the Anthony version where it's like different like word clouds and lines to like work through, that like helps kind of disarm the people participating to say, okay, this is really how these two kind of things are conversing with each other. So it's not like I'm not like come from the outer regions of like the galaxy and showed up with something that was like completely out of everyone's like understanding, but to try to present that common ground. So I do kind of do that sometimes to help bring people along.
Yeah, like I said, I think that there's a way that I think you mentioned the word disarm, like disarming the reader. I think that's a thing that's happening, and weirdly, for a lot of poets, like for people who, or not even just poets, just people who are very used to reading poetry, they're used to like a certain kind of disarmament. Like they're used to there's like a bag of tricks that sort of exists for lyrical poetry. That means that you're not always 100% sure what's happening, but you're comfortable in the way that you're not sure. And so I think sometimes your poems are purposefully balancing that act between giving someone something that they sort of recognize, whatever that tradition is, like whether it's like archival or poetry, and sort of also trying to lead them to a certain degree. That I think is often like intensely part of the poem.
I think, and that's kind of something I thought about when I was doing that opening section. Like that was a very purposeful thing. In the end, when I was doing like the last revisions, like the final kind of like, how do I order this? How is this working? And where should this go in the front versus somewhere else, right? And I thought, well, this section has like, there's left aligned, some of those stanzas that drop down from the gallo are are left aligned. Some of them, there's a prose poem in there. There's a litany in there. There's little forms that are, things that people can gravitate and latch onto and begin sort of like not only understanding the cosmology of the book, but also kind of understanding it as like a key, like on a map. If I can go through this, I can keep going and making it through and kind of doing that journey across time. That I wasn't like intuitively doing at the front end, but towards the end when I was kind of getting ready to submit it for what would be the prize that I won, that I did was I was able to make it kind of work a bit more effective than I had from other prizes that I had submitted to right at the start when I thought I was done.
Yeah, I think that this is like a thing that you're also doing with other kinds of visuals as well. I don't think we've seen we've seen two poems that use sort of symbols or diagrams, but your book also contains photos. I think Omnidawn did a beautiful job with the collection. I know you did a lot of the layout for the poems as well. But it's also like important to note that often, as you mentioned earlier, a publisher just like cannot or will not publish something that's not in the format, like in the sort of rectangular format that they're used to publishing. And even when that's not the case, like even when they're sort of open to other sizes of a book, it's often not possible to print photos. And both of those happen in your book. And so your book contains a lot of like historical photos, at least one like personal photo. I'm wondering, how important was it for you to like include these photos in the book?
For me, in an earlier iteration of the book, there were even more photos, more graphic, more horrific photos really of lynchings. And there is one in the book, but it's super, super tiny. And it's not necessarily clear that what's happening in the photo outside of the words that sort of encircle it. But it was important for me to exclude some of those photos, because I think that sometimes the power of the imagination to know what is happening, but not be able to see it and force it inward to sort of embody those words, those images, and have to imagine it yourself. And sometimes that's almost more graphic than what I could have just done by simply laying out a photo. But in terms of actually including photos, I know there was one that I remember very distinctly. My grandfather we were moving him out of his house, and he had built a shed that for about 15 years I went back there and played and lived alongside him, working on little projects, gardening, sharpening tools, fixing bicycles. And it was just this old, like 1940s toolbox that was like all wood and falling apart. And it might have been a converted like fruit basket, but I don't remember that. But in the middle of the tools was his alien registration card. And it was like a complete picture of like the time for him in his life where, these are the things he needs to go get work. He needs the tools to do the work. He needs the card to prove that he can now do the work. And that kind of captured all of those elements I was trying to think through in that opening section, but also bringing sort of the archival, non-personal components back toward me to understand where I fit into that as like someone who's like biracial, who's Irish and Mexican, who could be, the perpetrator or the victim, right? And then in the other part of like including photos and kind of reimagining sort of that archive, again, going back to like trying to help recreate that experience for the reader to understand these aren't things that we've just simply erased or textbooks have forgotten. They exist and they're out there and they're readily available to us. Maybe I'll read La Corona one of the poems that does use some archival stuff?
Yeah.
Let's do that. So this is a actual flyer of a barnstorming event of Joaquin Murrieta, who may or may not have existed, who may or may not have been lynched, who may or may not have been beheaded, who may or may not have had his head essentially preserved in a jar. And that's kind of encapsulates a lot of this histories, how they get erased or reframed. And so this was a flyer from here in California of just for $1 to see his head. La Corona, a Mexican lynching number 47. Anything can be trophy, just as anything can be ashtray, coffee cup, curb, flower pot, the inside of your wrist, the inside of another's wrist. Claim anything, anything. Witness, badge, halo, horn, colony, victim, vein, coffin, president, cadaver, the quiet breath of a body at rest. Claim, 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 anything.
It's one of my favorite poems in this collection, both in terms like visually, but like that first line, that anything can be trophy, just as anything can be ashtray. I think there's an element of that poem visually that reminds me a little bit of sort of like of graphic design, and there's like sort of an almost universal sort of language in graphic design that maps onto that poem in the sense that that tradition, that historical moment happened to Mexicans, happened to this person, but also in America has happened, as you've mentioned, to Black folks. To just it's timeless, right? In a really messed up and constant way. I think your use of or your decision not to use as many photos is interesting, because I think that photos always feel like they're tied to a particular, or often feel like they're tied to a particular moment, like because they're in black and white or because they're blurry and like not high fidelity or whatever. But words can sort of can sort of like be exist in all these other spaces.
Yeah. And there's definitely moments in the collection where I actually place the image and then erase the image, just out of my own sort of desire to then try to figure out what that information means to me. And I remember some of these I did very early when I actually laid over the box that basically blacks out the image. And over the time, one of the things that now, as we're talking about it, I remember actually forgetting what that original image was, because I had just been writing against it, revising, writing against it, revising. And it had now created sort of that timeless sort of other moment that's no longer attached to that specific event, but to the larger feeling and mood of the event. Does that make?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, you can go.
Well, it's just a weird thing as we're like talking, having this conversation, processing, and I'm thinking, yeah, there are some in there where I can't remember what the photo was, and specifically I'm thinking of there's a photo in there of a hanging tree, a lynching tree in Goliad, Texas, and I don't actually remember the original photo.
Is that the
'Cause
one? Is that the one that has the TripAdvisor reviews?
yes, it
That
has
poem
the
is wild.
TripAdvisor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a poem. That's another poem, is one of those things. And, that kind of like goes back to how that narrative has been spun, right? Where suddenly an event like a lynching tree, a place like a lynching tree becomes a place where people mete out justice, where really, hundreds of people were murdered at this tree. And now so much so it's ingrained that it's just another tourist stop that people to this day still put up TripAdvisor reviews of going out there and being like, hey, went out and saw it, cool tree, terrible story, great picnic though,
Yeah.
and it's like
5 stars.
Yeah, it truly, it really, it really does come out that way, where they're like ranking it, and it's totally, they've not only dehumanized and erased that history, but they've just decided to reinvent it as just an outdoor gathering, which does in that own way sort of mirror those postcards that would get sent out of people being lynched in the past, of we had a grand old time in the afternoon,
Right.
they're
Yeah.
committing these crimes. And it's just how that technology, the technology has just sort of reinverted how our bigotry and racism can manifest.
When I was 16, or no, I was younger than that. I was like 14 or 13. My family went on a vacation, and we went to a plantation and took a tour. And it's like that vacation. This is like the only moment I remember in some ways. Was the tour guide was like super bubbly. It was like like in a disturbing way, like because of like the history of this location. It was as if like nothing had ever happened here, except that someone built a giant, beautiful house. And I remember her saying, visitors are welcome to wear period appropriate dress. And I like turned to my dad and I was like, what? Like, that would be chains for us. Like, and she can see, like, maybe she can't tell that I'm black, but like she can definitely tell that my dad is black. And it just like didn't cross her mind. There's like an active rewriting of history. It's not just that in this TripAdvisor poem, or in that case, like that happened to me. It's not that they're like acting like it didn't happen. They're both acknowledging that it happened and sort of rewriting as if it doesn't super matter anymore. That this was like almost like it's like a one-time event that everyone got over soon after. It's just like very disturbing.
And that's how that through line, and that's how those through lines, happen. Like one of the things I know for the book that I debated about including was a lot of the epigraphs, just because there are so many. But then as I was kind of like doing, this archival work and like citing them and writing them down, like it wasn't like they happened and they went away. It's just like they just changed in different ways, right? It's like, an op-ed, how overtly racist can the op-ed be? And it just kind of, the language gets coded, it's still there. And then you end up with someone like the former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, being straight up just saying like the greatest like thing of white history is the Sheriff's Association. Like, this is ingrained in our culture. This is who we are. And, I wouldn't think of like the Sheriff's Association as being something ingrained in a culture, but in the manifestation of like American ideals, you get that. And then suddenly you start seeing how that has manifested right now today, where it's suddenly, Blue Lives Matter, and we're going to storm a Capitol, and wait, you're not supposed to get me. We're on the same team. We're on the same culture, and it's like, no, this is just some made up identity of Americanism to oppress everybody so white people can have all this power. And it's just disgusting. It's really overwhelming. And I'll just say that I remember reading some of these poems the day after the footage of George Floyd came out, and just reading them and then having to stop the class and just talking about it, because it was too much, too devastating, and too now in the moment of like, wait, 1851 is still 2020 and the class, and we just had to talk about that. And that was just, the poems aren't important anymore. We've got to the point of, we know what this is happening. We've seen it happen. Let's just talk about it for like the rest of this class.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a way in reading any of the poems in this book that, you know, you may be like, you're able to both be fully aware that this is a historical event, that this, you know, you're often putting the date that the thing happened on the poem, and yet it feels like so recognizable that you know, you can almost just shift that date like forward. It's like our date and that date are like creeping towards each other like constantly, right?
Yeah. It's like the inverse of like choose your adventure, but choose your horror and your oppression, right? It's just like the date isn't the just you punch in the date, you don't have to worry about the crime.
Right. Yeah. Well, so I think we're almost closing up. So I want to thank everyone for giving us this time, and again to Francisco for allowing this conversation. But I'm hoping to sort of give you a chance to read like one poem to sort of close this out and give you the last word.
Okay, that's totally cool. I think, you know, I just want to say thank you for everyone who's attending and hearing Keith and I talk and ramble and try to make sense of all the things that are always swirling around in our heads. I'm grateful for Francisco, for Letras Latinas, for having this idea, and all excited for all the shows that will come after this. Also excited to hear how a book club is going to be happening. I want to give a shout to Sarah Borjas for hosting a book club in conjunction with the Wendland District. I appreciate that. One of the things, I know we're talking about heavy things. And for myself, when I was writing the book, I knew that I couldn't just leave it with that heaviness. I was trying to find an outlet, a way forward, somewhere forward, so we can kind of protect ourselves and get things right, so we can move forward and heal and work and make the changes, not just set the score back at 0 and keep on going like nothing happened, but trying to get some sort of accountability, some sort of reckoning. So that's kind of how the book exits. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the title poem, which is the last poem in the collection, Borderland Apocrypha. And I will close it out with that, and just want to say thank you, Keith. It's just a joy to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Much love. So I'm just gonna read it. I'm not gonna share the screen. Borderland Apocrypha. If your father tells you, and your teacher tells you, and the pastor at your family's church tells you to perceive breath for existing, heart for source, grave as final, voice as kingdom, and the shaking as the escape of the earth's heat, you believe the repetition, but don't. Believe that earthquakes are fed by the buried, shoulders leaning in and sinewed by the unseen, combative to covert. Recall that beneath you, nothing is still. Recall that beneath you are the others. No, there is no such thing as living. Living is a birth to control you, to fear no longer being present, to fear this. Whatever your this is can leave you. The night's knuckle on your door is not consent, but a decay of the ego unheard. A nearness unknown until an apnea arrives, tearing you from bed for the noose, the blade, the bullet, the fingers forcing the larynx. You were never living. Your father will tell you. The priest and prophet and the succulent on the windowsill will not stop you and say you are not living. You are present. Some tomorrow, there'll be no sunrise. None will say, where is, where is, where is? They will believe you are no longer. Your blood will mourn. The other will gather to publicly demonstrate. Life is proprietary. Do not listen. Join the present at the tectonic and continue to be. Push. Press your ear against the mantle to hear the sound of the pavement's rupture. Push. The city will not sleep. Push. The flora fauna stone nod. You have always been present. Push. A valley is quiet whether cradling or culling. Push. The television and the paper will say the fault is active. Push. The scientists will diagram the earth halved and demonstrate why nothing remains static. Push. The present remain here. Push. Here. Push. Here. Push. Leave. Return. You exist. Push. You are present. Push. Swallow them into quiet. Thank you.